Hi everyone, welcome to this program, which, if you've been following the series on ancient Canaan, you'll definitely be interested in. In a sense, it's a continuation of that story. This episode will be the start of several programs on the Phoenicians. So without further ado, let's begin. First though, let's clarify some basic terms. What we geographically refer to as Phoenicia encompassed certain cities of the eastern Mediterranean coastal region that shared a common language, culture, religion, and sense of political solidarity. The terms Phoenicia and Phoenician are actually derived from the Greek word phoinis, meaning crimson or purple. Scholars aren't exactly sure why such a word was used to describe them, but it may have been due to a purple dye that was extracted from the murex shellfish found along the shores of the northern Levantine coast. The Phoenicians, though, probably thought of themselves as descendants of the Canaanite peoples of the Bronze Age. After all, they had much in common with their Canaanite ancestors. They more or less spoke a version of the same language, worshipped many, if not all of the same gods and goddesses, and as far as we know, maintained many aspects of the same culture. Phoenicia was not a kingdom per se, but rather a federation of city-states that was each ruled by a separate king. In fact, it had been this way since the beginning of the region's recorded history. The most prominent Phoenician cities were Byblos, Tyre, Sidon, Beirut, and Arvad. Being coastal cities and lucrative trade hubs, Phoenicia attracted many different peoples from all parts of the world. One such group were the infamous Sea Peoples, who according to Egyptian, Ugaritic, Cypriot, and other textual sources, ravaged the area and brought about what historians today refer to as the Bronze Age collapse of 1200 to 1150 BCE, which at least with regard to the Levant, brought about the end of Egyptian, Assyrian, and Hittite domination of the region. Egypt lost its empire in Asia, which was mostly in Canaan, and the Assyrians lost their connection to the Levant's lucrative trade with northern Mesopotamia. The Hittites, though, suffered the most, as their state was completely wiped off the map. Gone, finished, never to arise again. In place of these great powers, new political entities arose in the Levant, including Neo-Hittite, Aramaean, and other kingdoms such as Israel, Judah, Edom, Moab, and the Philistine states. Surprisingly though, the Phoenician city-states were left relatively unscathed by the Sea Peoples, and several scholars think that this may have been due to the Phoenicians simply paying them off. What is known is that after the chaos of the late Bronze Age, the absence of the once great powers of the region, the Egyptians, Hittites, and Assyrians, enabled the Phoenician city-states to completely dominate the region economically. Phoenicia's most valuable export was timber, but the Phoenicians also traded in manufactured goods created from ivory, wood, stone, metal, wool, and linen. These products were traded at numerous overseas destinations by seafaring Phoenician merchants, who also brought back to their cities precious stones, spices, gold, silver, and various other commodities that were in high demand. Such goods literally took them to the ends of the known world, especially towards the west. Westward expansion and colonization was really the Phoenicians' only option if they wanted to grow in wealth and influence. Thus, trading colonies were set up all over the Mediterranean in places such as Sicily, Sardinia, southern Spain, and probably most famously, the coast of northern Africa. Many of these were temporary settlements, but others, such as what became Carthage, not only became permanent, but great military and commercial powers of their own. Most of our sources on the Phoenicians come from Egyptian, Assyrian, Babylonian, Hebrew, and Greek texts, though there are plenty of Phoenician inscriptions that have been uncovered all over the Mediterranean world. Few of them actually give an account of Phoenician history. This doesn't mean that historical texts in the Phoenician language didn't exist, for we have references in Greek sources to the works of Phoenician authors, but copies of these referenced primary documents, at least so far, have not been found. This could be because many Phoenician texts were written on papyrus and thus probably disintegrated or were burned by fire during the many invasions of the area. Some of the earliest references to the Phoenicians come from the royal inscriptions of the Assyrian king, Tiglath-Pileser I, who ruled between 1114 to 1076 BCE. He claims to have not only visited the area, but also bring back the region's prized cedar trees to the Assyrian capital of Ashur, as well as boast about killing what's been identified by scholars as a narwhal while on a boating trip around the city of Arvad. One of his inscriptions reads, "I marched to Mount Lebanon. I cut down and carried off cedar beams for the temple of the gods, Anu and Adad, the great gods, my lords. I continued to the land of Amuru and conquered the entire land of Amuru. I received tribute from the lands of Byblos, Sidon, and Arvad. I rode in boats of the people of Arvad and traveled successfully a distance of 3 double hours from the city of Arvad, an island, to the city of Samuru, which is in the land of Amuru. I killed at sea a Nahiru, which is called a seahorse." Phoenicia's cedar trees were quite famous in the ancient world. Egyptian texts as well as the Bible mention them as objects of great value. The ancient Egyptian tale of Wanamum mentions ships from Byblos and Sidon filled with timber on their way to Egypt, while the Bible's books of Kings and Chronicles speak of King Hiram of Tyre sending loads of cedar wood to Jerusalem for Solomon's great temple. The cedar, though, came at a price. Solomon had to give up the control of 20 cities as payment. In his inscriptions, the Assyrian king Ashurnasirpal II mentions several military campaigns in the coastal regions of the eastern Mediterranean. An excerpt from one of his annals from around the year 870 BCE reads, "At that time, I made my way to the slopes of Mount Lebanon and went up to the great sea of the land, Amuru. I cleansed my weapons in the great sea and made sacrifices to the gods. I received tribute from the kings of the seacoast, from the lands of the people of Tyre, Sidon, Byblos, Mahalatu, Maizu, Kaizu, Amuru, and the city of Arvad, which is on an island in the sea. Silver, gold, tin, bronze, a large female monkey, a small female monkey, ebony, boxwood, ivory of Nahirus, which are sea creatures. They submitted to me." Such inscriptions may give the impression that Assyrian incursions into and the collection of tribute from the coastal regions of the Levant were easy. However, this wasn't the case. As the smaller kingdoms of the Levant realized that the tide of Assyrian expansion had no end, they banded together to form anti-Assyrian coalitions of their own. One of these was during the reign of Shalmaneser III, who ruled between 858 to 824 BCE. In a monument known as the Kirk Monolith, Shalmaneser III details one of these encounters that occurred in 853 BCE near the town of Karkar. Among the 11 or 12 rulers that he faced, 2 of them were the Phoenician kings of Byblos and Arvad. Though the Battle of Karkar was a stalemate, within a decade, Shalmaneser was able to defeat all of his rivals and demand tribute from them. By the reign of the Assyrian king Sennacherib in 704 BCE, fear had compelled most of the local kings along the eastern Mediterranean coast to submit to Assyrian rule. If the Assyrian king didn't like a local ruler, he could replace him at will, as the following text, attributed to Sennacherib, clearly demonstrates. "Luli, king of Sidon, whom the terror-inspiring glamour of my lordship had overwhelmed, fled far overseas and perished. The awe-inspiring splendor of the weapon of Ashur, my lord, overwhelmed his strong cities such as Great Sidon, Little Sidon, Bitziti, Zaribtu, Mahaliba, Ushu, Akzib, and Akko. All his fortress cities walled and well preserved with food and water for his garrisons, and they bowed in submission to my feet. I installed Ethbaal upon the throne to be their king, and imposed upon him tribute due to me as his overlord, to be paid annually without interruption. As we can see from this passage, it's clearly the Assyrians who called the shots. This, however, didn't mean that local rulers couldn't personally benefit from Assyrian expansion. There's a copy of a treaty between Sennacherib's successor, Esarhaddon, and a certain Baal, king of Tyre. Yes, this is the same name as the popular Canaanite and Phoenician god. In it, the king, Baal of Tyre, is made to be the servant of Esarhaddon with certain responsibilities and, of course, unquestioned loyalty to the Assyrian crown. In return, though, Baal is given control of several ports, such as Byblos, and even some, such as Akko and Dor, far to the south. With several gods and goddesses called as witnesses, the treaty states that Baal will suffer many curses should he break his oath. It turns out that Baal did break his oath and joined forces with Egypt and its Nubian Cushite pharaoh, Taharka. Baal's betrayal was noted by Esarhaddon in an inscription. In the course of my campaign, I set up fortifications against Baal, the king of Tyre, who trusted in his friend, Taharka, the king of Cush, threw off the yoke of the god Ashur, my lord, and kept answering me with insolence. I cut off the supply of food and water that sustained their lives. Esarhaddon later states, I conquered Tyre, which is in the midst of the sea, and took away all of the cities and possessions of Baal, its king, who had trusted in Taharka, king of Cush. And I conquered Lower Egypt, Upper Egypt, and Cush, struck Taharka, its king, 5 times with arrows, and ruled his entire land. I wrote to all of the kings who are in the midst of the sea, from Cyprus and Ionia to Tarsus, and they bowed down at my feet. I received their heavy tribute. I carried off gold, silver, goods, possessions, people, young and old, horses, oxen, and sheep and goats, their heavy booty that was beyond counting, to Assyria. I placed kings, governors, officials, and harbor masters over their lands. These claims may be a bit exaggerated, since there's no evidence that Assyrian forces ventured further south than Memphis, and eventually, Taharka was able to launch a counterattack from the Nile Delta. Esarhaddon does claim to have sacked the Egyptian capital of Memphis and even taken Taharka's wife and children, including the crown prince, Ushanahuru, back with him to Assyria, which is actually depicted on a victory stele. However, just a few years later, the region was in open rebellion against Assyria, and Esarhaddon was forced to make his way back to Phoenicia to put down the insurgents. He never got there, as he died along the way. His son, Ashurbanipal, succeeded him as king of Assyria. Many scholars debate if he actually went to Egypt himself, or rather dispatched his most trusted men to put an end to the insurrection. Regardless, in his royal inscriptions, Ashurbanipal claims that 22 kings from the seashore, the islands and the mainland, servants who belonged to me, brought heavy gifts to me and kissed my feet. I made these kings accompany my army over the land, as well as over the sea route with their armed forces and their ships. Among the 22 kings that Ashurbanipal names were the Phoenician kings Baal, king of Tyre, the same one actually as during Esarhaddon's reign, Milkiah-Shapha, the king of Byblos, and Iakinlu, the king of Arvad. Since the main part of Tyre was reportedly on an impregnable island, and since Ashurbanipal made no claims of its capture, it's unlikely that the city was held by Assyrian forces. However, Baal must have known that his city couldn't withstand an Assyrian blockade forever, and so probably thought it wise to renew the treaty that he'd made with Esarhaddon several years prior. Ashurbanipal more or less seems to confirm this in his annals from the year 665 or 664 BCE. In my third campaign I marched against Baal, king king of Tyre, who lives on an island amidst the sea, because he did not heed my royal order, did not listen to my personal commands. I surrounded him with redoubts, seized his communications on land and sea. I thus intercepted and made scarce their food supply and forced them to submit to my yoke. He brought his own daughter and the daughters of his brothers before me to do menial services. At the same time, he brought his son, Iahimilki, who had not yet crossed the sea to greet me as my slave. I had mercy upon him and returned him the son, the offspring of his loins. Iakinlu, king of Arvad, living also on an island, who had not submitted to any of the kings of my family, did now submit to my yoke and brought his daughter with a great dowry to Nineveh to do menial services. And he kissed my feet. When the Assyrian Empire finally fell around 610 BCE, its former territories in the Levant were taken over by the Neo-Babylonian Empire. Not all of them, though, were easy to acquire. Tyre, perhaps learning from its conflicts with Assyria, was prepared for a protracted siege. In 585 BCE, the Babylonian king, Nebuchadnezzar II, attacked Tyre, and at least according to the historian Josephus, held it under siege for at least 13 years. Even the Bible's book of Ezekiel makes fun of, the long siege and the aging of the Babylonian soldiers during the process. Son of man, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, drove his army in a hard campaign against Tyre. Every head was rubbed bare and every shoulder made raw. Yet, he and his army got no reward from the campaign he led against Tyre. In the end, it seems that both sides came to some sort of agreement, since a prolonged Babylonian blockade would have continued to have hurt Tyre in the long run, and Nebuchadnezzar probably grew tired, no pun intended, of devoting so many resources to simply subdue a city in the middle of the sea. The final result was that Tyre was allowed to be ruled by its local kings in return for vassalage and use of its large fleet of ships, which essentially gave the Babylonians a powerful navy. Around 540 BCE, the Persians conquered the area under Cyrus the Great. The period of rule under the Persian Achaemenid dynasty, from about 540 to 332 BCE, was overall a bit more peaceful, and for the most part, as long as they paid their taxes, the Phoenicians were allowed to do as they wished. Like the Babylonians, the Persians also inherited the Phoenician navy, which they used on several occasions. An exception to this, though, came during the reign of Cyrus's son, Cambyses. According to Herodotus, Cambyses wanted to launch a campaign against the Carthaginians, but the Phoenicians, especially ships and crews that were based in Tyre, refused. There was a good reason for this. You see, Carthage was a Phoenician colony that had been initially founded by citizens from Tyre. According to Herodotus, the Phoenicians were bound by a strict treaty and could not righteously attack their own sons. And the Phoenicians, being unwilling, the rest were of no account as fighters. Thus, the Carthaginians escaped being enslaved by the Persians, for Cambyses would not use force with the Phoenicians, seeing that they had willingly surrendered to the Persians, and the whole fleet drew its strength from them. The Phoenician navy, though, was instrumental in the Persian invasion of Greece in 480 BCE, which ultimately ended in disaster. In 343 BCE, there was a revolt in Phoenicia during the reign of the Persian king, Artaxerxes III, where according to the ancient historian Diodorus Siculus, an anti-Persian alliance was concocted between the Phoenicians and the Cypriots, with some help from the Egyptians. Though Tyre and Arvad were also involved, it was Sidon that initially took the lead. While its king, Tennis, with the help of some 4,000 Greek mercenaries, initially had some success, he was alarmed when he heard that a large Persian force, perhaps over 300,000 men with 300 ships, was gathering nearby. And so, he wrote to Artaxerxes III, informing him that he would secretly surrender Sidon to the Persians if he and his city would be spared. Keep in mind, though, that these numbers are believed by nearly all scholars to have been greatly exaggerated. Anyway, Artaxerxes agreed to the proposal. Though Tenes delivered as promised, Artaxerxes had him killed, along with several hundred Sidonians. The ultimate fate of the survivors was a rather tragic one. Diodorus states, "When they saw the city and the walls captured and swarming with the many myriads of soldiers, they shut themselves, their children, and their women in their houses and consumed them all in flames. They say that those who were then destroyed in the fire, including the domestics, amounted to more than 40,000. After hearing what happened in Sidon, the other cities of Tyre and Arvad surrendered without a fight and resubmitted to Persian rule, under which they remained until 332 BCE, when Alexander of Macedon, also known as Alexander the Great, came to Phoenicia." The historian Arrian writes, "Alexander marched from Marathus and received the surrender of Byblos, Sidon also, invited by the Sidonians themselves, who loathed Persia and Darius. Thence he proceeded towards Tyre, and on the way Tyrian envoys met him, sent by the community to say that Tyre had decided to accept Alexander's orders. However, when Alexander wished to offer a sacrifice to Hercules in Tyre's great temple, the Tyrians refused. Outraged, Alexander decided to punish Tyre and its residents. After a long blockade and siege in which he had to build a causeway to the main part of the city, which was on an island, he finally entered Tyre and killed many of its inhabitants. In addition, 30,000 of the surviving Tyrians and some Carthaginians were sold into slavery, after which Alexander is said to have finally made a sacrifice to Hercules and held a procession in his honor. As the region became more Hellenized, references to the Phoenicians in historical texts become fewer, until by the mid to late Roman period, they pretty much cease altogether. However, the Phoenicians' impact on Western culture is quite extensive. We'll discuss some of their inventions and innovations, such as the alphabet, in another program. As always, thanks so much for stopping by. I really appreciate it. If you learned something or simply just enjoyed the video, please don't hesitate to hit that like button because it helps the channel out a lot. Also, check out the History with Sai podcast, where I go into more detail with regard to some of the topics discussed on the channel. You can also follow History with Sai on Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter. Thanks again, and I'll catch you in the next episode. Take care and stay safe.